Welcome to the Economics and Happy Easter. In this podcast, I will present my take on how some of the major economies would perform in a de-dollarized world. At first, I want to recapitulate my view on the process of de-dollarization. And then I want to proceed to discussing four major economies, namely China, Russia, Europe, and the United States. I want to focus on these four economic entities, because they are the ones that are most surely engaged in this hybrid conflict that we're seeing today. And I know that there are other major economies who also have a strong stake in de-dollarization, and they could either suffer or benefit from this process. And there are a lot at stake, indeed. But I want to limit the scope today, and also for the reason that I do not necessarily know these economies well enough to make even an informed speculation. Notably, I'm referring to the Indian economy. So now let's start. First, I want to present very briefly my view on the process of de-dollarization. If you look at, if you haven't listened to my podcast from just a month and a half ago, where I discussed the process of de-dollarization, I encourage you to do so. Essentially, what I'm seeing is that the United States, being overly indebted, cannot really maintain its credibility, even without some of its recent, I would say, transgressions or imprudence in managing its currency. With these transgressions or imprudence, I think that the trend of de-dollarization is irreversible. I think that the credibility of the dollar-led financial system is being lost, and it's continue to be lost. If later this year, or perhaps next year, if they start to sanction China even further, and perhaps to seize some of China's foreign currency reserves, and perhaps to basically do the same thing that they did to Russia, to China, then I think that will be the total collapse of the dollar system. This is not necessarily going to happen in that dramatic fashion, but nevertheless, this is just the exact triggers, and not necessarily what I can say with absolute confidence. But what I am confident is that a fiat currency cannot serve a stable long-term global reserve currency. This is basically the Triffin Dilemma. I think this Belgian-American economist who suggested, I think, really half a century ago. Essentially what he said, and my understanding, is that the dollar as a fiat currency cannot really be a credible long-term global reserve currency. And the reason is that either America needs to maintain the credibility that has afforded it the economic power by basically maintaining its industrial base, by maintaining a current account surplus, thereby limiting the liquidity of the dollar, making it impractical to be used for global trade. Or the United States would basically run deficits and trade deficits, and then it would basically issue a lot of dollars. That would ensure the liquidity in the global financial system, but at the same time, the credibility of these dollars will be lost, because since the United States is always running a deficit, and this deficit, as the global economy grows, needs to grow larger, then it comes no point when the United States will be able to pay back its debt. And when the United States is not paying back its debt, it's always being more heavily indebted, the risks of a default gets higher and higher, and there comes a point when the United States can no longer credibly issue the currency, which is a global reserve, but which is also really devalued, continually being devalued and inflated away. This is Triffin Dilemma. And this applies not only to the United States, but to every currency, every fiat currency that aspires to become a global reserve. In essence, what Triffin Dilemma suggests is not that the United States dollar, USD, cannot be a global reserve currency. It is that a fiat currency cannot be a global reserve currency. And this is also why I said in one of my previous podcasts, and I think this is, again, something that has been mentioned by a lot of economists, so I'm not, besides the ones who are really aligned with the American establishment, but a lot of the more, shall we say, outside the mainstream, economists outside the mainstream, have suggested that a new global financial system can be based on trade, can be based on asset reserves. I think really what's going to happen perhaps is going to be some bilateral based on trade, right? Based on the economic activities. In essence, when two countries trade together, they can hold the currencies of each other, and there can be economic blocs that with similar economic backgrounds that they can even share a currency, but that currency needs to all these currency unions have risks, so there needs to be some mechanisms to restrain the abuse of power of one party over the other. But there are different ways to manage this without resulting to a pure gold-backed global financial system. And indeed, even though I think that gold and silver, being the monetary metals that they are likely to continue to appreciate with regard in relation to the fiat currencies over the long term. I think not necessarily that they will be. In fact, they probably will not be the global reserve, because the fiat currency, even though it has a lot of problems, one great advantage that favors fiat currency is that fiat currencies can be created by government officials out of thin air, and this is a power too great for politicians and government officials to give up. So I think it's very difficult to envisage a future where people in power will willingly give up a great part of their power over the control of the economy, and resort to gold-backed currency. And I also want to say that Bitcoin absolutely cannot be a global reserve currency, because Bitcoin by nature is it's slightly deflationary. I follow a quote-unquote economist perhaps he is an economist indeed, but not an academic economist, Peter Schiff. And this guy likes to say that deflation is good. I think deflation is good for the consumer. But deflation, in an absolute sense, is not necessarily good. In fact, it's not good for economic activities, because you need to have a little bit of, I think my take is that the best, it's a stable price. Basically, the price does not go up or come down. Because in a deflationary environment, what happens is that a company that needs to borrow money to do production, their borrowing cost actually goes up all the time, right? That becomes counterproductive to productivity. But of course, in a highly inflationary environment, then it's very bad for consumers. So it's either the supply side or the demand side. I think neither is really good. What is really good is a neutral, stable monetary policy that keeps basically 0%. Ideally, the inflation should be running at 0%. But at the same time, 0% inflation does not mean that there is no new issuance of new money. 0% inflation only means that the issuance of money corresponds with the increase in productivity. So as the productivity grows, if the total supply of money remains stable, then there will be deflationary. Let's say the price goes up 10%, then we will see perhaps 9% decrease in prices of everything. This will be really actually not very good for economic growth either. So ideally, you want to keep up the pace. Your productivity grows 10%, your money issuance goes up by 10%. Anyway, this is a little bit of background on the process of de-dollarization. Now let's move on to the second part of today's podcast. The 4 economies. First, let's talk about China, which is something, I'm from China. I have a little understanding of the Chinese system. I cannot pretend that I really know what the central government or the government official people in the Politburo thinks. But, that's just my limitations. But nevertheless, I think I have some understandings. One of my viewers suggested that perhaps that China would try to strengthen the Chinese yuan, the renminbi, in a process that would help the country, help China conduct its dual circulation strategy. I think that this is not really going to happen. I don't see that even in a de-dollarized world, that China would seek to strengthen the renminbi. Rather, I think the Chinese government will seek to weaken the Chinese yuan a little bit. Now, I'm not saying that China would let inflation run wild. So if, let's say, dollar sees some really high levels of sustained inflation, 20% a year for running for a few years in a row, then I think in that case, the Chinese yuan will have to appreciate in relation to the dollar. That will force the Chinese economic system to undergo a structural change, structural revolution. That's going to be something that is very painful. Ideally, my view is that the Chinese government hopes doesn't plan on, but hopes that the Americans, the Federal Reserve, will be able to keep a cap on the inflation situation, and perhaps keep it at 10%, under 10% for the next few years, and then get it under control. Now, I'm saying this, not meaning that the Chinese does not want to really seriously stop using the dollar and to dethrone the dollar as the global reserve currency. I think they do. But what they do not want is to have a very strong Chinese yuan that makes it impossible for China, or let's say, not impossible, but make the Chinese exports highly uncompetitive. I think they would really fight it until it comes to that point when inflation in China is getting a little bit out of control. China is relatively still a poor country. It's really done a quite good job in terms of combating poverty, but at the same time, its wealth, especially among its working classes, is certainly not comparable to that of the developed countries or the developed economies. As a result, these people have, the working class has a much lower tolerance to inflation. And let's also make it be very clear, the Chinese people are not very patient people. The public are not very patient. They have, I would say, high support for the government today, because the government has been quite good at improving their standards of living. Once, if the government lets inflation run rampant, if people have difficulty getting food, putting food on the table, or even getting a roof over their head, then the support would not be the same as it is today. And that will be more of an existential threat to the government than anything else. So I think what I'm seeing is that the Chinese will take a very cautious approach to de-dollarization. They will not seek to strengthen the renminbi, but they probably will seek to weaken it. But they will still they will try their best to not let inflation run rampant. And they are somewhat equipped to do it. Mostly, I think, because it is still a highly controlled currency, highly controlled economy, and the Chinese government has the world's largest reserve of food, of grains, and it has a lot of other reserves of other metals and other resources. So I think, and also, of course, China still has a manufacturing economy, so that when the government changes the knob and changes the monetary policy, it will be able, in my judgment, to control inflation without without letting it really running wild. That's China. Now let's talk about Russia. Russia has a much smaller economy, and it is my sustained view of that has developed in the last few weeks, that Russia absolutely, in my view, did not plan to have this prolonged war. I think I've read a lot of commentaries from even some of the more official sources in China, which are criticizing Russia for being hesitant. Right? They say, I read a very interesting commentary today. In fact, just before the recording of this podcast, in which the author suggested that the sinking of Moskva, the heavy cruiser, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, is a clear indication that the Russians were were too hesitant. They did not really seek to. It doesn't really matter whether it is because they mismanaged, the crews mismanaged, and there was there was an accident on board, and the ship sank, or it was because there was some cruise missile fired by the Ukrainians, or maybe by some, I don't know, other NATO forces. Doesn't matter how the ship sank. That this war lasted a month and a half without a clear sign of ending soon is enough indication that Russia did not go in hard enough and is now paying a price. I think this is a point that we need to really consider, because this author also provided a very interesting point. He said that every war that the Americans engaged themselves in after the end of World War II, when this conflict lasts more than 2 months, the conflict always ended in American defeat. It was Americans lost in Vietnam, in Korea, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, all because when you have an unclear military objective, and when you have a political class that is hesitant, that does not set a clear target, it becomes very difficult for the military to succeed. And with this defeat, America lost a lot of prestige and financial resources. I think that nevertheless, it is still my view, for the moment, that Russia will achieve its political objective. And it's my view, and I think the view of a lot of people that are more objective, that are not really, drunk on the Kool-Aid, think that the Russians, what their motive is to build a land bridge from Kharkov to Transnistria. I think that is their goal, but at the same time, there is a non-commitment, right? They do not want to commit to this political objective. I think first because they find this to be something that is that can be criticized by the West as some sort of imperialism. They do not want to do that. They are afraid of being criticized as imperialists. Instead, they want to consider themselves as liberators. All good with that, but at the same time, I think another aspect that needs to be considered is that the longer this drags on, the more financial resources that the Russians will actually need to expend, and this is not really good for the Russian economy. Even though the casualties are not that high, even though the war is not that fierce, at least to now. So I think this is going to be a little bit more challenging for Russia in the years ahead. I think that the good thing about Russia is that it has its commodities and natural resources and a lot of military hardware that are really welcome and really in demand worldwide. This means that Russia as a nation will be able to continue to run a trade surplus, and by their new scheme to accept rubles for a lot of their foreign trade, they will be able to keep a relatively stable ruble. I don't think that it is in their interest to let the ruble appreciate either. So that, I think, it's something that we must not really go into this, somewhat misguided hope that Russia would win this war very clearly, and then afterwards it's going to experience an immediate economic boom. I think that after the end of this war, Russia will still face rather difficult economic circumstances, and it needs to dispense a lot of resources to rebuild the parts of Ukraine that it captures, namely from Kharkov to perhaps the Dnieper to Nikolaev and Odessa and Transnistria. All this line, Mariupol, Donetsk, Donbass, all this entire region. This region has been is in the process of being really destroyed by the war. And this rebuild is going to really take a lot of resources. So if Russia really manages to succeed, and I think that they will, but really after the success, what exactly going to happen, I don't know. But in the best case, I see that it will take them about 10 years to 15 years to rebuild this region. During this time, I think it's going to be a little bit small economic difficulty in Russia. Afterwards, if this rebuild is very successful, the integration of part of Ukraine into Russia really creates the synergy that it expects. Then we will see that the Russian economy take off after this. So I would say that it takes about a decade. Right? It's not something that is going to be all good immediately. And this goes back to another point that I repeatedly make, which is that the best, and I think this is also a point that you need to take away from the art of war, which is that to win without fighting is the best option, right? That the fact that Russia needs to resort to fighting already means that it's going to suffer some consequences, and it's not very good. But nevertheless, I think that chances are that they will be able to. Now let's move on to the third entity, which is the Eurozone. I continue to I have criticized the Eurozone, the economic policies of the Eurozone. For over a decade, I've seen a lot of nonsense coming out of the Eurozone. I think the only thing that they did right after the quote-unquote great financial crisis was that they implemented some austerity measures, and they did not really go into to quantitative easing. It was, I think, a bit later that they started quantitative easing, and they started to nationalize a lot of the debt. Essentially, what they have been doing is monetizing those bad debts, and those debts held by some of the worst capitalized banks in the world, Deutsche Bank, etc. This has been really bad. I think now we also see Italy. I read today that Italy has a per capita debt of over 100,000 euros. Right? Every Italian citizen has a debt of over 100 on average. Not on average. The national debt, if it's averaged on every person, is over 100,000. I don't see that these people, over the lifetime of their lifetimes, they will be able to pay on per capita even more tax than 100K. I think not everyone will be able to pay that much tax, and that would mean that if all the government's income is used to pay off the debt, that would be barely enough for one generation. Obviously, that's not going to happen because the government continue to run deficit, so the debt will continue to go up. This is not a situation that is limited to Italy. I think Greece, France, I think some of the other ones, maybe Ireland, they are all pretty bad. They are all in the Eurozone. I think also Belgium is very, very bad. The ones that are decent have been Germany and the Netherlands and Austria, these northern, quote-unquote, northern European nations. They have been doing much better, much more responsibly in terms of their fiscal policies. But nevertheless, with the current conflict, I predict, and I think this is perhaps inevitable, a process of deindustrialization in these core economies. Germany, Austria, and I would say also in France, even though France is one of the basket cases. So what will happen, I think, I can see three possibilities, one of them being highly unlikely. The first one, which is highly unlikely, is that perhaps somehow the Eurozone will be able to overcome this difficulty, that they will be able to really find a way to find the resources to pay off their debt and to rebalance their economies and create a more sustainable future. I mean, economically, not necessarily in terms of energy. Now that's nonsense. I see one way that they could do this. And this is perhaps, just as I mentioned in my last podcast number 52, which is that if the Europeans, together with the Americans, manage to defeat Russia in their current proxy war, if the European Union will be able to seize, to exploit the natural resources from Russia for free, do whatever they want, right? Fulfill the fantasies of Napoleon and Hitler. If they are able to do that, then I think it is possible that the Eurozone will be able to overcome this challenge. They will, in fact, see perhaps an economic boom. Overall, I see this as very unlikely, right? Because obviously, if there is no Russian defeat, I think that the euro is done. I think, in fact, in a couple of years, the euro is done. The Eurozone really needs a quick win in Eastern Europe. Is this possible? I think still yes, but unlikely. Secondly, I think it is also possible that the Eurozone would disintegrate in an orderly fashion. By orderly, I mean perhaps a country, one of the major economies, will decide to leave the Eurozone. There have been some suggestions that this could be Germany, but I fail to see that now because, with the current government, not going to happen. What the next government will do, I don't know, but current German trajectory is one of the deindustrialization. And once Germany embarks on this path, once Germany ships its industries to Asia completely, it's already been in the process, but if it completely ships its industry away, if Germany becomes another Britain, then I think the willingness to leave the Eurozone will be much lower. I think it will be a new economic reality. So I don't really see a very highly likely outcome of an orderly disintegration. This leaves us the last possibility, which is an disorderly disintegration. Something that has to do with very, very high sustained inflation, perhaps hyperinflation. Hyperinflation, I think, is over 20% a year. I think I could be wrong. Don't quote me on this. I think over 20% a year over a long period. I don't know how many quarters that will be considered hyperinflation. I think that could be one way that the monetary union disintegrates. So all in all, I think the Eurozone is a basket case. It is very pessimistic. I'm very pessimistic about the future of Europe. I see no bright future for Europe for the next generation. After that, it is certainly possible, right? Everything is possible with the correct leadership, with the correct population. It is possible, but currently, no. Then now let's go visit the world's largest economy, the quote-unquote indispensable nation. I think really if this process of de-dollarization progresses, what's really going to happen in America is that immediately the standards of living will fall, that the asset bubbles will perhaps go up a little bit, but then eventually it will actually pop. Things will get more expensive, and the social problems, this is something that worries me the most for America. They have some very severe social problems that have become more obvious, evident in the last couple of years when there are some of these economic difficulties. Because when the economies are good, it's always difficult to see these social problems. When the economies turn bad, social problems really come to the fore. This is something that worries me. But at the same time, I think America has still a relatively robust system. It has relatively robust institutions, much better than a lot of the other major economies. So I think that in a generation, after a decade, I think their economy will be perhaps growing again, particularly with the depreciation of the US dollar. The real wages of American workers will actually come down. The purchasing power will be lower and living standards will be lower, but that provides for a better basis, better foundation to grow the industries. And since America still has a profoundly secure geographic location, it is so rich in natural resources, and it's so rich in human capital. I see that perhaps in 1 decade, in 2 decades, its economy will go up again. So I think that's basically what's going to happen. In short, so this basically is the main content of today's podcast. I know it's a bit long because I have to touch on several major economies, one after the other. Now let me just recap this a little bit. First, about China, what I see is that it's going to try to keep a rather stable, perhaps a little bit weaker currency. I think the government will not hesitate to lower the standard of living of its population, but I think they will not dare to go into hyperinflation or highly inflationary territory, because that will be destabilizing for the political structure. For Russia, I see that because this war has become a really prolonged one, I think the cost for Russia will be quite high. If Russia will be able to win this war, and if it will be able to rebuild Russian economy and also rebuild part of Ukraine that it annexes, then I see that the Russian economy will boom in perhaps 1 decade or 1 decade and a half, so 10 to 15 years. I see that could happen. For the Eurozone, I see that there is a small chance that Europe will win, and I think they are betting the house and the wife and the children all on this, because the alternative is that there will be a prolonged depression in Europe for a generation at least. Lastly, about the United States, I see that their major challenges is not really the disappearance of the dollar as the global reserve currency, but really it's social problems that it must resolve before it becomes a strong competitor again. But nevertheless, I see that perhaps they will be able to resolve it, and within 1 or 2 decades, America will again become a major economy in the world. Not necessarily the indispensable nation, but still one nation that is absolutely critical, at least in the economies of the Americas. So thank you very much for listening to today's podcast. Just to remind you again that this podcast is available also on Odyssey and Rumble. And I also have created a Telegram channel. All the links I will put in the description. Thanks for listening and have a great day. Also, Happy Easter.